This is one of the most shocking, heartbreaking, and unforgettable true crime stories you will ever hear. A 14-year-old schoolgirl walking home in broad daylight is savagely stabbed 44 times, her bag thrown high into a tree. For decades, police chased false leads, suspects came and went, and the real killer walked free. Nearly 30 years later, a tiny drop of blood would shatter the silence, revealing a chilling truth no one saw coming. This is the most disturbing, emotional, and jaw-dropping case, and you need to see how it ends. Tina Feltz was born on April 27, 1969, in Washington State. When she was still young, her parents separated, and Tina moved with her mother to California, settling in the quiet town of Pleasanton. Not long after, her mother remarried a man named Steve, and the couple welcomed a son. Tina, just 6 years old at the time, was overjoyed to become a big sister and eagerly helped care for the baby. Her parents trusted her with babysitting duties far beyond what most children her age would handle. From an early age, Tina showed a strong sense of independence. She thought carefully about her future, and by middle school, she was already mapping out her college plans and setting aside money to one day buy her own car. In 1984, at age 14, Tina was a freshman in high school, and she wasn't exactly happy about it. Naturally quiet and reserved, she kept to a small group of friends. Unfortunately, her shyness made her an easy target for bullies, and she soon found herself on the receiving end of cruel taunts from other girls. She even considered transferring to another school at the end of the year. On April 5th, Tina's day started badly and only got worse. When she walked into the cafeteria, a group of girls began harassing her, threatening to wait for her after school. The school itself had a rough reputation, the kind of place she'd only ended up in because it was closest to home. That very same day, another incident underscored the school's problems. Several boys shoved a classmate into an outdoor trash bin, and when a teacher pulled him out, they discovered he was heavily intoxicated. As it turned out, students had been drinking alcohol during class. Tina's mother had offered to transfer her somewhere safer, but Tina decided to hold out until the school year ended, just a few months away. Still, the day brought yet another blow. She was told she'd have to stay after school as punishment for her frequent tardiness. Tina had once taken the school bus, but that changed after relentless bullying from the same group of girls who tormented her in the cafeteria. The ride became unbearable, so her mother began driving her to and from school instead. But with her mother juggling her own morning routine before work, Tina often ended up running late. The school decided to punish her for her tardiness with after-school detention, but Tina wasn't about to stick around. Instead, she made up her mind to skip it and head straight home. Her house wasn't far, but the walk wasn't exactly simple. From school, she had to follow a narrow path leading to an underpass beneath the highway, then continue a few hundred yards more before reaching her front door. That afternoon, Tina left school around 2:50 p.m. At first, other students were walking the same path, but one by one they veered off toward their own neighborhoods, until she was alone. Roughly 20 minutes later, a truck driver traveling along the highway above the underpass spotted something strange near the tunnel's entrance. A figure lying motionless on the ground. Concerned, he took the nearest exit to turn around and get a better look. When he crossed back over the overpass, his worst suspicion was confirmed. It was a body. Without a cell phone, he searched for the nearest payphone to call for help, but on the way, he saw a police cruiser and flagged it down. Almost simultaneously, officers received another call, this one from a group of students who had been walking the path and stumbled upon the same grim sight. Police raced to the scene. Lying near the mouth of the tunnel was the body of a young girl. From the heavy pool of blood surrounding her, it was immediately clear she had been stabbed multiple times. The area was cordoned off as detectives began their investigation into the brutal daylight killing. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Your support means a lot to us and helps us grow. A huge thank you to everyone who's been watching. The first thing that caught investigators' eyes was a handbag dangling from the low branch of a tree, just a few yards from the body. When officers pulled it down and looked inside, they found identification. The victim was 14-year-old Tina Feltz. A sweep of the area turned up little of value. Detectives bagged several items scattered nearby, including cigarette butts, but nothing immediately tied to the killing. The murder weapon was nowhere to be found. When police broke the news to Tina's mother, they showed her the recovered bag. She confirmed that none of Tina's personal belongings were missing, ruling out robbery as a motive. That left investigators hoping the medical examiner and crime lab might uncover something more concrete. But the results were grim in another way. Tina had been stabbed an astonishing 44 times with what appeared to be a kitchen knife. There was no sign of sexual assault, eliminating another common motive. The sheer number of wounds suggested rage, a frenzied personal attack, more likely committed by someone who knew Tina and carried a deep grudge. Tina's mother told detectives about the relentless bullying her daughter endured at school. Police began scrutinizing each of the girls involved, but the lead went nowhere. Every one of them had also been assigned detention that day and was accounted for by a teacher. Then came a break, or at least something worth chasing. A fellow high school student reported that shortly after school let out, while driving on the highway near the underpass where Tina's body was found, he saw a classmate named Jeff sprinting toward the tunnel. Detectives soon learned that Jeff was no stranger to trouble. Around school, he had a reputation as one of the main bullies, the kind who zeroed in on weaker students and made their lives miserable. Several girls had even accused him of inappropriate behavior. What really set off alarm bells, though, was his habit of carrying a pocket knife everywhere he went. When officers brought him in for questioning, they immediately spotted a fresh cut on his finger. Jeff first claimed he'd sliced it at work while cutting pizza. Later, he changed his story, saying he'd hurt himself removing a vent cover. The shifting explanation was enough for police to secure a search warrant for his home. Inside, they found 2 hunting knives, both of which were sent to the lab for testing. But results came back clean. No traces of blood, no forensic link to Tina's murder. Jeff denied any involvement, and without hard evidence, detectives couldn't make an arrest. That was the core problem in this case. There wasn't a single piece of concrete physical evidence tying anyone to the crime. The scene itself had yielded nothing useful. No fingerprints, no personal items, and no biological traces that could later be tested with DNA technology as it advanced. Jeff remained on the suspect list, but investigators were forced to keep looking. Tips poured in from the community, yet every lead fizzled out. High school students began pointing fingers at one another, and in some cases, even bragged to friends that they were the killer. But when those same students were hauled in for questioning, they quickly backpedaled, claiming it was all a bad joke. Cruel pranks in the wake of a real murder. Before long, investigators began looking closely at Tina's stepfather. They learned that his marriage to Tina's mother had recently fallen apart, the result of his heavy drinking and increasingly aggressive behavior. Friends and relatives of Tina's mother confided to police that he had been physically abusive, though she herself denied it. Despite the separation, he had been trying to win her back. Just days before the murder, he showed up at the house unannounced, The visit quickly spiraled into a heated argument, with Tina stepping in to shout at him to leave her mother alone. When detectives brought him in, he claimed he'd been at work when Tina was killed, and his co-workers backed him up. But then they uncovered a detail that made them pause. After hearing about Tina's death, he had taken a bus driven by an acquaintance to her mother's house. Before getting off, he handed the driver a knife and asked him to hold it for a while. To police, this was more than suspicious. The man insisted it was nothing sinister. He said he simply didn't want to walk into Tina's mother's home carrying a knife, given that her daughter had just been stabbed to death. Investigators pressed further, but his alibi held. Eventually, they were forced to cross his name off the suspect list. 5 days later, a fresh lead surfaced, and it was a big one. In the town of Felton, about 50 miles from Pleasanton, a young woman was walking through an underpass when a stranger attacked her. He threatened to kill her if she didn't do exactly as he said. But she managed to break free and sprint to safety, reporting the assault to police immediately. Detectives working Tina's case were immediately struck by how closely the Felton assault mirrored her murder. Before long, they tracked down the suspect, a 23-year-old man named Walter, and placed him under arrest. When they began digging into his past, an unsettling picture emerged. Walter had been living in Pleasanton at the time Tina was killed, only to move away almost immediately afterward. On the very day of the murder, he had visited his grandmother, visibly agitated, and told her he didn't like where his life was headed. Armed with a warrant, police searched Walter's home. Inside, they discovered clothing stained with blood and 2 knives, both of which were also streaked in red. It seemed like a breakthrough until the lab results came back. The blood wasn't human at all, but animal. The development was a blow to the investigation. Detectives continued to press for evidence linking Walter to Tina's murder, but nothing they found would stick. Eventually, they shifted focus. Though Walter's name was never erased entirely from their list of persons of interest. In the weeks that followed, a more unsettling theory began to take shape. What if Tina's killer hadn't stopped? Over the next few months, 3 more young women were murdered in and around Pleasanton. Though the cases differed in some details, investigators began to suspect they might be connected. The possibility of a serial predator sent shockwaves through the once quiet community. Women avoided walking alone. Parents kept their children within arm's reach. Public pressure on the police department intensified with each new killing. But despite their efforts, every lead ended the same way, in a dead end. Years slipped by without a single breakthrough in Tina's case. Then, in 1989, tragedy struck again. Another young woman was found murdered in Pleasanton, just a few miles from where Tina's body had been discovered, and once again, near an underpass. The crime bore unsettling similarities to Tina's killing, but like the others before it, the case went cold. It wasn't until 1994 that the investigation took an unexpected turn. By then, DNA analysis had transformed criminal investigations, and forensic experts re-examined evidence from the series of unsolved murders. This time, they got a hit. The DNA belonged to 35-year-old Michael I.D., already serving time for the brutal murder of a 66-year-old woman. With the match in hand, detectives began to suspect Michael in 3 other killings, Tina's included. When investigators shared his photo with Tina's mother, her reaction was immediate. She said she recognized the man, claiming she'd seen him at a barbecue years before Tina's death. She even searched through old family photos for proof. But when she found the picture she had in mind, her heart sank. The man in the photo looked strikingly similar to Michael, but it wasn't him. For years, investigators tried to connect Michael to Tina's murder. They scoured his history, his movements, his acquaintances, but every possible lead came up empty. In the end, they couldn't tie him to two of the other killings either. Still, his DNA was enough to convict him in the one case they could prove, and he was sentenced to death. 2 years later, in 1996, another cold case cracked open. This time, DNA pointed to a man named Robert Rhodes. But just like before, the relief was short-lived. No evidence connected him to Tina's murder. Over the next decade, a handful of new names surfaced as possible suspects, but each one denied any involvement, and with no evidence to prove otherwise, the investigation ground to a halt once again. Then, in 2007, Detective Dana Savage decided to take another look. Pregnant at the time and unable to take on her usual field assignments, she shifted her focus to cold cases, and that's when Tina's file landed on her desk. Savage read through every report, every witness statement, every scrap of evidence collected over the years. Nothing pointed clearly to a killer. But one strange detail refused to leave her mind. Tina's bag, found hanging from a tree near the crime scene. Savage knew Tina couldn't have thrown it up there in the middle of a brutal attack. Whoever killed her had to be the one who did it. By then, forensic technology had advanced far beyond what investigators had in 1984. Savage decided to gamble on a theory. During the frenzied assault, 44 stab wounds in total, the killer might have injured himself. If so, even a microscopic droplet of blood could have landed on that bag before he tossed it into the branches. The local lab didn't have the tools to detect such an old, tiny trace of blood, so the bag was sent to the FBI's crime lab. And there it sat. For years. Finally, in March 2011, Savage got the call she had been waiting for. The FBI had found it. Minuscule traces of blood clinging to the fabric of Tina's bag. Even more stunning, they'd managed to build a complete DNA profile. When the sample was run through the national database, it hit. The blood belonged to Stephen Carlson. When the name came through the line, Detective Savage froze. She had been certain the DNA would point to one of two other longtime suspects already serving time. But this name, Stephen Carlson, was no stranger to her. He'd been buried deep in the case files for decades. Carlson had walked the same school halls as Tina back in 1984. He was just 16 then, and if you remember, he was the boy shoved headfirst into a trash bin near the cafeteria on the very day Tina was killed. He was also the student who steered police toward Jeff, the knife-carrying bully once high on the suspect list. In those early days, detectives had even considered Carlson himself a possible suspect, but they'd found nothing solid to pin on him. Still, his reputation preceded him. Around school, Stephen Carlson was known for crude, sexually explicit comments to girls and sudden bursts of aggression. The other kids kept their distance, whispering behind his back and calling him Creepy Carlson. Isolated and angry, Carlson was often the target of bullying, something that seemed to fuel his rage. By 15, he'd already fallen into heavy drug use, a habit that sent his behavior spiraling further out of control. He bounced in and out of juvenile detention for minor crimes, never staying locked up for long. Over the years, several acquaintances went to police with chilling claims. Carlson had told them he'd killed Tina. But each time officers confronted him, he brushed it off as a joke. There was never enough to hold him. After leaving high school, Carlson graduated to adult prison, serving 2 years for attempted assault. Freedom didn't slow him down. He went straight back to drugs and even refused to register as a sex offender, racking up more arrests along the way. By late 2010, Stephen Carlson was living on the streets, his life unraveling under the weight of addiction. That December, he was arrested for drug possession. For the first time, his DNA was taken and entered into the national database, a seemingly routine step that would prove pivotal. 6 months later, the FBI finally completed testing on Tina's purse. The results were explosive. The microscopic traces of blood belonged to Stephen Carlson. By then, Carlson was already serving time for the drug charge, so detectives went straight to the prison to confront him. The moment they said Tina's name, his demeanor shifted, tense, uneasy, but he still denied any involvement. The DNA told a different story. Convinced they had their killer, investigators charged Carlson with murder. His defense attorney fought to have the case moved to juvenile court, arguing that Carlson was only 16 when Tina was killed. The judge wasn't swayed. The request was denied, and the case was bound for adult court. What followed was 3 years of legal maneuvering. Carlson stayed locked up the entire time. Then, in a cruel twist of fate, tragedy struck again. On the very day jury selection was set to begin, Tina's mother suffered a fatal heart attack. She would never live to see her daughter's killer face justice. The trial was postponed yet again, eventually opening in October 2014. Despite his lawyer's efforts to cast doubt, the jury was unmoved. Stephen Carlson was found guilty of murder and sentenced to 26 years to life in prison. Even then, he refused to take responsibility. From his cell, Carlson declared his innocence and filed an appeal, determined to fight the verdict. For years, Stephen Carlson's conviction wound its way through the appeals process. Then, in 2017, his attorney scored a partial victory. The court agreed the prosecution hadn't definitively proven Carlson intended to kill Tina, which meant the first-degree murder conviction wouldn't stand. The charge was downgraded to second-degree murder, and his sentence was cut to 16 years to life. Even with this reduction, Carlson refused to acknowledge his guilt, at least not publicly. Then, in 2020, everything changed. From behind prison walls, Carlson penned 3 letters, one to Tina's family, one to the police, and one addressed directly to Tina herself. For the first time in more than 3 decades, he accepted responsibility and laid out his version of what happened that April afternoon in 1984. Carlson wrote that he'd been seething with anger after being humiliated at school earlier that day when classmates shoved him into a trash can. Adding to his fury, his house was still a wreck from a party he'd thrown the night before, and he knew his father would punish him for it. Fueled by frustration and alcohol, he stormed home after school, grabbed a kitchen knife, and started walking aimlessly in the opposite direction, with no clear plan in mind. As he emerged from the shadows of the underpass, he spotted Tina. In his own words, without thinking, he launched into a frenzied attack. Carlson claimed he had no memory of the assault itself, only the image of standing over Tina's lifeless body, the knife in his hand dripping with blood. In his letter to Tina and her family, he wrote an apology that came far too late, admitting she had done nothing to deserve what happened to her. Even with his sudden confession, many questioned whether Stephen Carlson truly felt remorse. Under the terms of his sentence, he could one day walk free, but only if a parole board believed he was genuinely sorry and no longer a danger to society. For convicted murderers who maintain their innocence, parole is nearly impossible. That's why some suspected Carlson's letters were less about conscience and more about strategy, a calculated move to improve his chances of release. If that was his goal, it didn't work. His first bid for parole was denied, and he remains behind bars. Still, his sentence allows for repeated attempts, meaning there will be other chances. And one day, the board might decide differently. After Carlson's arrest, a wave of voices from the past emerged. Former classmates spoke up, claiming that back in 1984, almost everyone at school suspected him. He'd already been a social outcast, avoided, ignored, and whispered about. But despite the rumors, police at the time were chasing other, seemingly stronger leads, and no one ever came forward with anything concrete. In the end, it wasn't gossip or suspicion that brought him down. It was the precision of modern DNA science and the relentless persistence of Detective Dana Savage. Ironically, if Carlson hadn't been arrested for drug possession in 2010, his DNA never would have been entered into the national database. And even if investigators had tested the tiny speck of blood on Tina's purse years earlier, the result would have been meaningless without that match in the system. That single twist of fate, a drug arrest decades later, was what finally sealed his fate. Without it, Stephen Carlson might still be a free man today, and Tina's murder might have remained a mystery forever. Be sure to let us know what you think of the story in the comments below. And if you like this video, smash the like button and don't forget to subscribe. A playlist is going to pop up right now with more videos you'll love. See you guys next time.